We're going to start by reading Daniel chapter 3. I want this text to be fresh in your mind, and I've translated this for our Spanish-speaking members, and so you should have that on your handouts as well. But Daniel chapter 3, and I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version up here. Verse 1 says this: King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." And therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And therefore, verse 8 says, at that time, certain Chaldeans, Chaldea and Babylon is basically different terminology for the same thing here. The Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego. And these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego be brought. And so they brought these men before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. And he declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? And they answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." And then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, "Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." And then Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, no smell of fire had even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. And therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. I think we could almost just read this chapter, and that almost be the lesson in and of itself. You could make a lot of simple conclusions from what we have just read, but we're going to make a few points to consider about this text as we think about some lessons from the fiery furnace. I want you to think about yourself, first of all. Think about your own life and think about your own experiences. I just simply want to ask you right now, what are the fires of life that you have faced as you've tried to serve God? And what are the fires of life that you are facing right now as the result of your own faith? And maybe you can relate in a different way to these 3 Jewish men who are living in Babylon. This is pagan country. Living in Babylon, exiled, who are facing their own fiery trial in Daniel chapter 3. So think about a few lessons with me from this fiery furnace of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego that go along with our theme this year, being tested by fire. The first thing that I want you to notice in Daniel chapter 3 is that we have a problem. We have a problem. And the problem is this: that King Nebuchadnezzar wants Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego to serve other gods. And I think if you'll consider it in your own life, you might ask yourself the question, what other gods, what other images, what other idols is the world asking me to serve? Babylon was a real city. So we're talking about real Babylon when we read Daniel chapter 3. But it's interesting as you look at other passages of Scripture, especially when you get into the New Testament, Babylon begins to be used as a figure, begins to be used in a figurative way. For example, in the book of Peter, Babylon is mentioned, but it isn't referring to real Babylon when you read Peter. Babylon is probably being used in a figurative way to the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire that was pressuring and putting the people of God in difficult circumstances. Again, when you read the book of Revelation, you find references over and over again to Babylon, but we know the book of Revelation is a highly figurative book, so it probably doesn't refer to real Babylon. It refers to something else, but the something else is something that is putting pressure upon the people of God and making their lives difficult. And that figure comes from instances like these from Daniel chapter 3, where Babylon did make it difficult for the people of God, for the servants of God to do his will. So what are the images? What are the idols? What are the initiation rites that the world is placing upon you as a Christian? Here in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar had built this big image of gold, and he wanted people to bow down to it. And he felt like if you didn't bow down to it, you're being disloyal to him. So there was great pressure to bow down to it. What are the things that our world wants you to bow down to? I don't know if we have real images of gold, at least not in this culture. You have them in other cultures. I don't know if we have real images of gold like they had here in Babylon, but what are they? Perhaps you can think of an extreme example, especially within the last couple of decades that we've seen become more prominent in our culture, rainbow flags, right? I mean, there's some businesses that they feel pressured by the LGBTQ community to put a rainbow flag up in their business, because if you don't, it indicates that you're not being supportive of those causes. And so for some people, it might be something like that. But it's not usually, with a lot of people, that extreme. Maybe for us, it's just something as simple as a trophy. We want you to give your all, even if that means abandoning your faith and your responsibilities to your faith, so that you can win this trophy in your sport or with your music or whatever it might be. For some people, it's their degree. The professor wants you to abandon everything in his department so that you can give your all to winning that degree. And there are college students that will abandon their faith all so that they can put a little framed picture on their wall that they have a degree. Sometimes it's money. And sometimes people are willing to abandon their responsibilities to faith all so that they can have a little bit more money in their pocket. Sometimes it's sinful things. Sometimes our idols become things like alcohol. We feel very peer pressure because our friends are drinking margaritas and cocktails and they're participating in happy hour. And so we feel like we should probably do that too, because it'll make the boss happy. It'll make the potential client happy. It'll make our friends happy. And so we feel pressured to involve ourselves in those types of things. Sometimes it's drugs. Sometimes it's sinful things. Sometimes the idol is your own self. You just need to look in the mirror. And in our culture, that's extremely prominent. You don't need to worry about what God wants of you. You don't need to think about what your godly parents would ask you to do. You need to please you. You are the idol. And in a humanistic culture, we can understand that's the way people would think. We don't worship fake idols, the things that are, remnants of polytheism and polygamy. No, we are the idol. We don't believe in other gods. We are the God. And so worship yourself. Make yourself happy. Whatever it is, the world props up all of these idols and images and encourages us to bow down with them, to serve them, to make these things the supremely important cause of our lives. And when these idols and images would cause us to betray our loyalty to Jesus Christ, then Christians, we have a responsibility. We must avoid conformity. Romans chapter 12 says this. It says, as he writes to Christians in Roman Empire, being pressured by all the various things that our culture pressures us into, he writes to these Romans in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, where Larry read to us earlier, and says this: I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, and do not be conformed to this world. Don't let Babylon tell you what to do. Don't let Babylon become a higher priority than Jesus Christ himself. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove, just as Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego proved that God's will was right, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so, you're in a different situation than I am, but what is it that the world is asking you to serve that is putting you in conflict with God and with his will? Now, the next question that we might consider as we look at this text is, who is Satan using to pressure you into conformity? Because Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the only one who was pressuring Shadrach and Meshack and Abednego to conform. We read this several times. I got kind of tired of reading it, actually, where it says the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, all the officials. You could have just said everybody. Everybody seems to be involved in what King Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to be involved in. They were giving absolute loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar. Who is the world using to pressure you into conforming to these idols and these images? You know, what you see in Babylon was that there was clearly peer pressure. Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego, they were among the leaders of the people of Babylon. They were the choice Jews. They were pulled out of Israel first because Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire saw that they could use these people for their kingdom and their purposes. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were extremely smart, young, good-looking, talented people, and so they were part of government. And so they were expected to conform to what government was asking them to conform to. So there was clearly peer pressure. There was peer pressure and political pressure from the king's herald himself. Look at verses 4 and 5. It says, "Then a herald cried aloud, 'To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages.'" It doesn't matter if you speak a different language or if you're from a different nation. No, everybody is expected to conform to what Nebuchadnezzar is asking them to conform to. And in Babylon, there was not only peer pressure and political pressure, but there was also self-preservation pressure. Because after all, what's the ultimate consequence if you don't conform? Well, you're going to get canceled. And you're going to get canceled in the most extreme way. You're going to die. They're going to throw you in a fire. Okay, so verse 6 says, here's what's going to happen if you don't conform. Whoever doesn't fall down and worship, you're going to be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. Now, how would that make you feel if you're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? It's going to make you feel very lonely because you're going to look around and be like, well, it's just us three guys. We're the only three Jews out here. We don't read of any other ones, at least. There may have been. But they're the only ones that are noted. Feels like it's just us three, so you feel very isolated. And that's how peer pressure makes you feel. Are you really not going to go along with what our government says you should do? Are you really not going to go along with what your coach is saying to do and all your teammates are doing? Are you really not going to go along with what everybody at work is doing? Everybody else is signing off on this form. Aren't you going to go along with it too? And it makes you feel awkward. It makes you feel isolated. It makes you feel lonely. That's how peer pressure works. We feel strange when our friends are all involved in a behavior that we shun. And sometimes they make us feel strange. Look at a few passages with me. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, where we read about how some of the Christians felt who weren't going along with some of the sinful things that other people in the culture were. Peter says, "We have spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness and lust and drunkenness and revelries and drinking parties and abominable idolatries." He says, in regard to these, they think it's strange that you don't run with them. How are they making Christians feel? They think that you're weird. They think it's strange. Why won't you go drinking with us? Why won't you involve yourself in this idolatry? Why won't you get drunk with us? Why won't you participate in this lewd talk? Why won't you tell dirty jokes with us? Why don't you do these things? Well, they're making you feel weird. That's how peer pressure works. Take a look at verse 12. Peter writes, and he says, "Beloved, don't think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you as though some strange thing happened to you." He says, when people start making you feel strange, don't think that it's strange. God knows you're going to have to go through the furnace. And God knows that you're going to have to go through the fires. And so don't let them make you feel that way. Well, you're made to feel like unpatriotic rebels when you don't go along with the evil causes of national leaders as well. Right? How do you feel when you're the business owner that's on the block and everybody else has a rainbow flag up in their window and you're the only one that doesn't? Well, people are going to make you feel, what's wrong with you? You know? You must be weird. You must be one of those Christian people. You must be one of those people that hates gays, right? That's things that they say. No, we don't hate, but we have principles, we have morals, and we live by those morals, and we live by that conduct. And that conduct doesn't mean that we can just tolerate any and every sin. Sometimes we're made to feel that way. And sometimes even our government can make us feel that way. If you're not part of the DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion movement, then you're rebelling not only against our culture, but you're rebelling against our government. Our government's starting to mandate things. You may be guilty of a hate crime if you don't go along with that in some circles. Some preachers may be even at some point in time accused of a hate crime if you preach against that. But in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, the government tried to make the first apostles conform to being quiet about the resurrection of Jesus. And they said, we must obey God rather than men. So you can bully us and you can threaten us and you can make us feel lonely and awkward and strange and like we're weird, but we're going to do God's will. That's peer pressure, though. Sometimes we get scared into conforming when our positions are on the line. If you don't go along with what the company is doing and what the management wants you to do, then you might lose your job. When I preached in Kokomo, Indiana, it's a big union town, and sometimes being part of the union, there were expectations to vote for certain candidates. And if they found out that you didn't vote for certain candidates sometimes, you would be heavily pressured in a union town. Where I preached in Kokomo for a long time, there was Chrysler plants. And back in the day, I'm told, if you drove into the Chrysler plant driving a Honda or some foreign car, you would find your car keyed and flipped over because the union people did not appreciate that you were not supporting the American-made vehicles that they were making and supported their industry. It's pressure. I would just say make better engines than Chryslers and a drive. Anyway, sorry if you're driving a Chrysler today. I just hurt your feelings. But we can become scared into conforming when our positions are on the line, when our jobs are on the line, when our livelihoods are on the line, or even our lives. Even Peter, by the way, this isn't just something for new Christians or weak Christians. Peter was a strong follower of Jesus. Peter told Jesus just a few moments before Jesus was betrayed, I'm never going to deny you. Even if everybody else does, I'm not going to do it, he said. And then a few moments later, everybody comes with their swords and their stabs and their clubs, arresting Jesus. And all of a sudden, Peter's denying Jesus, acting like he doesn't know him, cursing so that he can fit in with the crowd because he's trying to conform, because he doesn't want to be named with Jesus. You know, we can act really strange when our livelihoods and our lives are on the line. We can really change. Well, that's the pressure. Satan uses the world to try to pressure you into conformity, and you need to see that for what it is when it happens, if you're a Christian. But there's a third lesson I think we can learn, and that is sometimes it's not just pressure. Sometimes the pressure leads to persecution. Our refusal to conform will lead to persecution. So how do you respond to the flames of persecution? When our life is out of step with the world's, there's going to be finger pointers. There's going to be critics. There's going to be people ready to cancel us. And they're not always as motivated by the cause, by the way, as they are their own selfish motives. Do you think everybody was just really upset that Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego weren't worshiping this image like that was really important? Do you know what I think a lot of the people really wanted? They wanted the position that Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego held. And they saw this as their opportunity to get Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego out of the way. And if you take a look, you can see some of their methods. Look at verses 9 and 10. First of all, they're brown-nosers. I guess that's the best way that I can put it. They really try to let King Nebuchadnezzar know how loyal they are, how good they are, how much they love him, and what a good king he is. And you can kind of see through that fakiness in verses 9 and 10, if you think about it. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, this is right after they'd accused the Jews, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree, and these people over here, they're not following your decree. How dare they? Why are they saying that? Well, they're envious of the position that they hold. They want that position for themselves, and they see this decree as the opportunity to move them out of the way. That's why there's the flattery, maybe that's a better way to put it, of King Nebuchadnezzar, and that's why there's the tattling upon the people who weren't conforming. Now, let's think of it this way. Can this happen in real life? Let's say you tell your boss, you know what, I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, we worship on the first day of the week, and I don't think I want to work Sundays anymore. And a coworker uses that against you to get himself promoted and to get you demoted. They say, you know what? This person, they don't want to work Sundays, but I'm willing to work Sundays. And so why don't you go ahead and just let me have their position? Does that happen in workplaces? Absolutely. Or let's say you tell your coach, I'm not going to miss worship on Sundays for practices or games. And so your teammates see that. And they want your position. And they want more playing time. And so they use that against you. Say, Coach, I'll be there. I'll be there. Whenever we have a practice, I'll be there. So you just go ahead and put me in that position. Does that happen? Absolutely, it happens. Zoe once had a coach who said, God's here on the field too, not just in the church. So I don't see why it's such a big deal that you miss church. That's pressure. My dad, I just found this out, which is crazy to me, but my dad is in a play in Westfield. He tried out for a play. He's 78 years old. He got the lead. And so here in a couple of months, he's going to be in this play. But he told them, I'm a preacher. I have Bible study on Wednesdays. I can't practice on Wednesdays because of Bible study. Of course, there would be some who would use that against him to get the part that they wanted. But kindly enough, they did switch around the schedule so that he didn't have to come on Wednesdays. Sometimes, by the way, if you'll just ask, people might just show you some favor in those areas. But you got to be willing to ask. Sometimes, though, people will use our faith against us, and it will lead to persecution. And as was their intent, their report makes Nebuchadnezzar very angry. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to give you another chance to redeem yourself. We played the music. You didn't follow along. You weren't singing along. Why weren't you singing along? Because I don't agree with your song. But I'm going to play the music again. And this time, I want to make sure that you bow down like I said. And how do they respond? Well, that's our next point. They're persistent. They're persistent. And I think that's the next point that we learn from this text. We must refuse to cave in to sinful pressure. Look at verses 16 and 17, and they simply say this, to the king. And every once in a while, the Bible says you should obey your rulers, you should obey your leaders, you should obey your masters. But when there is a contradiction of faith, when they're asking you to do something that is immoral, then the Bible also teaches us you must stand up for God, who is greater than any man who would ask you to do something that contradicts your faith. And that's what Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego do. They answered and they said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. These Jews would not be bullied by a lesser king than the king who is the most high king. Now, what I think is interesting about that is these guys could have used a lot of different excuses, right? They could have just said, like we do, well, we're in the minority, we might as well just go along with it. Sometimes people think like that. Well, we'd be the only ones who weren't doing it, so let's just go ahead and do it. They might say, well, we're young, they're not going to listen to us. So they might just kind of dismiss themselves. Or they might say, we're far from home. We're not in Jewish territory anymore. And since we're, when in Babylon, do as Babylon, right? What happens in Babylon stays in Babylon. Maybe they could have thought that, right? Nobody's going to know if we bow. They might have thought that to themselves. It's just going to be us. We'll just keep it between us. We won't tell anybody. Sometimes that's why we give in. We're alone. Nobody will find out. God always knows what's going on in your life. He's always got the recorder running, okay? He sees all, he knows all. Everybody else is doing it. They could have said that. What's it going to hurt? They could have said, well, if we just obey, we're going to live a longer life and we'll be able to do more for God later. So it'd be a real shame if we lost our lives right now. We've got so much more to live for. Or they could have just said, we know it's just an idol. Let's just go through the motions. We know in our hearts that this is stupid and this is silly, but let's just go ahead and do it. But they don't make any of those excuses. They just say, this is wrong. The command of God, the 10 commandments are pretty clear. Don't bow down to any other image. We know this is wrong, and we're not going to do it. And if you have to put us in the burning fiery furnace, King, then go ahead and do it. And we'll get delivered somehow, some way. Now, I think this is important because people are asking you to do something. Notice they're not just silent about it. They don't just try to make some fake excuse up about why they won't do it. They don't make some excuse up or justification in their head about why they go along with it. They plainly speak, here's why I am not going to do this. And we as Christians have to be willing to plainly speak our convictions when someone is asking us to do something that's in contradiction to God's will. I will not do this, here's why. And that's what they do. I cannot go along with this, here's the reason that I will not go along with it. And so when it comes to your convictions, do you have the boldness and the courage of a Shadrack and a Meshack and an Abednego? The courage to say, I just can't do that because my God expects me to do this. Not everybody does. You know, during the time of Jesus Christ, there were even people that we read in John chapter 12, verse 42. They knew that the miracles led to a certain conclusion about him. They knew that clearly there was something different about Jesus, but it says in John 12:42, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him. They were quiet because they were afraid they were going to get put out of the synagogue. They were afraid of the persecution. They weren't willing to take a stand. They were afraid about what coach was going to do, what government was going to do, what boss was going to do, what professor was going to say, what mom and dad were even going to say. They were scared of the Pharisees. And it says what that said about them, verse 43, is they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. If that's you, you're not doing God's will because you're more interested in making your friends happy and your buddies happy and your boss happy, those people. Look, here's how long that's going to last. That's it. You love the praise of men more? You want the applause of men? You want people to be happy for you? Great. That's going to last just a few short moments. I'd rather live for the praise of God, which lasts for eternity, than the praise of men. So, Nebuchadnezzar punishes them as a result. I want to tell you, have you ever noticed how many times Paul says things like hold fast in the New Testament? Stand firm. He says those things because he knows that we're pressured to conform. He knows that we're going to be persecuted. So he wants us to understand that when you are in the faith, you've got to hold on tight. You got to hold on strong to it. I remember when our kids were little, you know, we had been to some restaurant where they have the helium balloons and they give the kids a balloon and then as soon as they walk outside, the wind blows, it's gone. The kids are crying. You're like, oh. Either we got to tell the kids to shut up or we got to go inside and get another balloon. It's terrible. You tell them, hold tight. You learn from that. Hold on tight, or you tie the balloon around the wrist, right? Hold tight. That's what the scriptures say to do with your faith. Well, here's the awesome thing. If you will stand strong in your faith, if you will hold tight to God, then God will be with you. And God is with them in the fire. We see his presence in the fire. Daniel chapter 3, I love this section. They get thrown into the burning fiery furnace. And then King Nebuchadnezzar, verse 24, was astonished. And he rose in haste and he spoke, saying to his counselors, didn't we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they said, true, O king, we did. He says, look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. Just like Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego said, you can throw us in the fire, but our God will deliver. In fact, the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. We often feel like we're alone when we're going through these fiery trials because other people may not be there with us and for us. Sometimes we feel awkward and strange and isolated. But the truth is, through this entire trial, God was right there with these 3 men. Whether this was an angel, whether this was the pre-incarnate Son of God, I know people have that debate. It is clear, though, that God was finding a way to comfort those who were standing for his will in a difficult circumstance. That presence of God, it's reminiscent of what God had promised through Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 43 in verse 2, God says through Isaiah, he says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. And when you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. That's not just an Old Testament promise, though. Jesus promised his disciples in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And there's another one, Hebrews chapter 13. Sometimes the reason why we go along with the peer pressure is because the money means more to us. The position means more to us. The applause of people means more to us. But I want you to think about what Hebrews chapter 13 says in verse 5. It says this, let your conduct be without covetousness. When you covet money, applause, trophies, that's the pride of life that you're coveting. This passage says, let your conduct be without covetousness and be content with such things as you have. Now, why? Because he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, why is that important for these Hebrew people to hear? Well, these Hebrew people were being tempted to backslide because they were being rejected by some of their Jewish brethren who hadn't converted to Jesus Christ. They were being rejected and pressured by the culture. They were tempted to backslide. So what was it costing them? It was costing them their livelihood, some of them. It was costing them possibly their lives. They were being persecuted. They were being pressured. So what's he say? Don't let your conduct be with covetousness. Don't be so focused on the money and the position and those things, and trust. God has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so verse 6, so we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? That's to be our response to the pressure. I'm not going to fear. Man can't do anything to me. God's got me in his hand, and God's with me through this. So you're not alone. That's just what I want you to hear today. Whatever it is that you're facing, whatever trials you're facing, whatever pressure you're facing, you're not alone, brother and sister, because God is with us in the fire. And if you'll stand, and if you'll endure, and if you'll be persistent in your faith, let me tell you, it will start to change people's minds and hearts about how they feel about God. And that's what we see with these men. Overcoming the fiery furnace leads to the contagious praise of Nebuchadnezzar, the king himself. Nebuchadnezzar goes from saying, everybody needs to follow me, and I don't care what your God says, who's going to deliver you from my hand, to saying, don't anybody speak about the God of Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego, because he is the most high God. He still believes in his polytheism, right? Still believes in gods, but their God must be the most high, supreme God. And therefore, nobody speak about the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. One day, not even death is going to defeat us, and we are all going to praise the God who gives life. So don't bow the knee. Don't bow the knee to false gods now. Bow your knee to Jesus Christ, who's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. How are you responding to the fires of life? And does your response indicate that you trust in the presence of God through the fire?